Hello and welcome to a new series on the Farmgate podcast channel that we're calling Nature Friendly Farmgate. I'm FFINLO COSTAIN, the editor of 8.9.com.
And I'm Martin Lyons, the Chief Exec for the Nature Friendly Farming Network.
And in this series, Martin and I are going to try and reflect on the food and farming policy landscape in each of the 4 UK nations. And we're also going to take advantage of Martin being here to find out a bit more about how and where he farms and the ups and indeed downs of trying to make a nature-friendly living from the land in the midst of ongoing financial policy and geopolitical instability. And we're going to try and do all this through a reasonably positive lens. And Martin, perhaps that kind of brings me to a question. So let me start by asking you this. While the NFU could rightly be criticised for its cup-half-full approach to government and communications, often defending the status quo and reacting against policies that it doesn't like, the Nature Friendly Farming Network often takes a very different perspective, and you're often quoted giving the government credit for what they're trying to achieve. So I guess the question is, do you think the NFFN could be criticised for sometimes being a bit too soft on the government?
I think some people could feel like they could criticise us, but I try and work with governments across the country, across the nations, in finding solutions to problems and actually moving our industry into a better future of better profitability, but also delivering in better environmental outcomes, climate solutions, and the multifunctionality of our businesses and farming to do that. And that does mean sometimes actually having to praise the government for doing things when they haven't done everything we've asked, but they've at least moved in a direction. And if we can continue to complain at them and moan at them, why would they want to engage with us? And we've found that opportunity of having better engagement by trying to have a better constructive relationship.
Do you see when you're in a room and you're there perhaps around a table with representatives from the NFU and yourselves and other NGOs, do you kind of see a roll of the eyes from the government, either in reality or so you sort of sense that roll of the eyes when they hear from the NFU criticising them? And do they have a different approach to you? How does it feel when you're in the room?
I think government are well, engaged with various different organisations, and yes, we come from different asks and perspectives. I'm trying to help work with farmers to go move things forward. Other organisations are trying to say, actually, it's a bit difficult. We've got to stay where we are. It's not our fault. I recognise some problems are farming's fault, but it's not the farmer; it's the system. And yes, I think it has given us increased opportunity to have deep, good engagement and talk through policies and decisions. And that doesn't mean we get everything we want to ask and we want, but at least we have good relationships. And we're finding increasingly opportunities to be in the rooms and at very high levels, helping to sort of shape things that hopefully leads to better outcomes for farmers.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, this is 20 years ago, this anecdote, but I'm remembering being at a conference and there was a panel. I was in the audience with a guy called Michael Jacobs, who was a government advisor, did a lot of sort of advocacy work with government for government at international level on the climate crisis at the time. And Andy Atkins, who was the then CEO of Friends of the Earth. And I can remember Andy, sort of being in his sort of normal approach of sort of criticizing what the government was doing. And Michael Jacobs just sort of making the point that, do you know what, that there was so much that the government of the day had been doing, that they felt that they'd been doing that was positive. And all he heard from the NGOs was just take. It was just, you haven't done this, you haven't done that, you haven't done the other. When actually he kind of wanted the NGOs just to occasionally say thank you. It's like recognition that they had done something that was positive, albeit it wasn't enough and they needed to do more. But at least start from that position of saying, good, well done, you've done this. In the same way that if you're talking to a child, if you just berate that child or berate a dog every time it does something wrong, you've got to give that sort of positive recognition as well.
Yeah, very much so. And I see so many organisations and campaigns where they're complaining to the government that you've got to fix this. Government wants to know the solutions. Come with problems, but with a solution. Because government are people, and it's not up to them to find all the solutions. It's us to help them as well. So come with some positivity, come with some gratitude where things have moved, or at least you've had the opportunity to discuss something and understand why it can't move. Because some things it's not in their power to move at that time. But at least you'll be able to have that conversation and then offer farmers, so they can see farmers who are delivering the solutions they're thinking about creating a policy for and say, look, if you do it this way, look what can happen. And we've found that's given us really good opportunity interactions, not just with the Westminster government, but with many of the devolved governments as well, and some international work we're starting to do.
I wonder if it's sort of partly a reaction to the type of government that we have and the way that Parliament works, where you're at two swords length, aren't you, across the aisle away from each other, and often it's just a kind of roaring and berating of the other, which lacks any sort of nuance. Certainly in England, but then when you go up to some of the devolved assemblies, go up to the Scottish Parliament, it is more collegiate. There is a bit more working together, albeit that there's clearly debate and argy-bargy, but it strikes me that a more adult sort of way of approaching these things, a more grown-up way of approaching these things, is to recognize that there is nuance, that government has challenges and constraints that it's working within in the same way that farming does.
Yeah, and politics is about debate and almost civil argument. If you're the opposition, you can criticise everything the current government does, and if you're in the government, you're trying to defend it. And it is that's kind of how politics works in the news and media and social media. But actually, constructive engagement, that's where things get done, and it's about that engagement with all parties across all places around, okay, so you want to object against this in your opposition place. This is why you may want to ask these questions and come from that angle because you'll get a better outcome. So how do we hold a government to account with opposition parties and organisations, but also work with government to try and get those better outcomes?
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll perhaps come back to that a little bit later in this conversation. But, we've launched straight in and I just want to explain to people what we're doing. As I said, this is a new monthly podcast. We've got 6 months of dates sort of there stuck in the diary now in good red pen. And the two of us are going to have those conversations across that period. And so I guess the first question really is around, why we're doing this. So obviously we have wheat from the chaff already that I run with Joe Stanley, where we sort of chew through some of the news items of the time, and we have a guest on. Often we're trying to sort of get to the nitty gritty of these different news items that we're talking through. And I guess Joe is coming from a slightly more skeptical approach sometimes of the way the government operates, trying to hold them to account in that way that you've just talked about. What we're trying to do slightly different, isn't it, is to try and find that positive emphasis. And I just wonder if you could talk us through, why you thought the podcast was necessary and the sort of issues that you might hope that we cover.
I think it's that kind of finding solution, that positivity. Some of the stuff governments do is really difficult. Farming can be really challenging, but we've got to look for solutions. We've got to move forward in those challenges. And I think the opportunity of this podcast is to watch different things are happening in different devolved governments. What's the best that may be happening in Wales, and we might be able to bring across and offer to other farmers and other policymakers, and have that bit of joined up work that goes across the nations, because we're one big island with many different governments in, and actually nature, water, climate, farm produce, farm production knows no boundaries in many times, but we're farming together trying to get the best outcomes. So having those different voices and perspectives from different places and different focuses on opportunities, but also some of the challenges that could be focused on getting better outcomes. I think it's a real good opportunity.
Absolutely, and as I said, we're going to talk about the 4 UK nations and look at those policies in some detail, as you just mentioned there. And of course, your own expertise, your own advocacy work is largely focused in England, isn't it? Much as you sort of have a helicopter view, I suppose, of all the devolved nations' work as well. But we're going to be bringing on representatives from NFFN, Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, aren't we? So that we get a bit more of the nitty gritty on those policies, and we're able to pull out the best and indeed some of the challenges as we go ahead.
Yeah, that's right. And I farm in Cambridgeshire in England, so my business is built around England policy and that. But in my role, I'm supporting and developing the organisation that works across the nations with steering groups in England, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland. So I'm trying to have a grasp across the whole business and as for farmers, to also help shape and steer all of that work. So for my role is to have knowledge of everything, but not always in depth. And that's the benefit of bringing people in that are focused in the different nations, that can come in and give the real nitty gritty detail or the real sort of voice from Scotland or Wales into this podcast.
Fantastic. Now, I think we should give people a bit of a sense of who you are, because I imagine that people, will know of you. They'll have seen you quoted in various different places, maybe seen you on panels. But let's try and get a sense of you as a farmer, and some of the challenges that you faced in your business, some of the things that you really wish you'd never tried, some of the things that have gone well for you over the course of the last year. And let's just start by talking about where you are. You said you're in Cambridgeshire. You're not quite in the Fens, are you?
No, we're on the hill in Cambridgeshire almost, on heavy clay soil, and we look down across the fens, and out the other side it's the chalks of Cambridge City and South Cambridge on there. So we're pretty much in the centre. Very good connections with infrastructure and roads. That is also becoming challenging because of the growth that's creeping around us. But we're basically round an arable system, but we used to be very mixed, but trying to bring livestock back in and trying to get that balance of environmental improvements, production improvements, soil health. And my own journey was, we did some stewardship, and then we started to value the habitat that was in that stewardship, that pollinator or the predatory insects. And then we started focusing on soil health because I recognised our soils are depleting. They're standing in water more often. They're becoming harder. And actually, it was our cultivation systems, our then farming systems that were actually adding cost to my business by destroying our soils. So we've gone on our own journey over a number of, over 20 odd years now. And what I found is that it does improve our business. It doesn't make us, massively more profitable than anyone else, but it de-risks us sometimes. And I've faced the same challenges of we wanted to get into the latest schemes, but because of RPA delays in managing their paperwork, we missed out. In the same as again with the capital grants. So I'm facing the same challenges as many farmers. I'm not gifted by having early access to information and getting a preferential treatment. And we're trying to run our business as profitable as we can, but focusing on environmental improvements, soil health, more diverse cropping. And we've gone, like many, sort of down that regenerative, rejuvenating route, thinking about, we bought a drill with a crimp roller, because if you look on social media, especially in other countries, a crimp roller is the thing for the future. We don't use glyphosate. It doesn't work as well as you think in Cambridgeshire. It works on some crops, but not everything. So we have been learning for the last several years as much as we can and share with neighbours, but also recognising we were moving away from an area-based payment that gave us guaranteed payments to a more action payments, public money for public goods, which makes our business more difficult because that guaranteed payment isn't coming. So I needed to learn early, and now I want to share some of the learnings with others. And that's the beauty of the network, of working with a range of farmers, sharing information.
Fantastic. I'm going to go into some of the detail on that in just a moment, but I'm just sort of trying to locate you still within the UK. I think you're about sort of 10 miles east of St Neots. Is that about right?
Yeah, that'd be about right. Yeah.
Yeah. And I remember, because I used to live probably about 20 miles north of you in a place called Chatteris in the Fens. So I was sort of on the edge of the Fens. And you reminded me of a time, really, soon after I'd moved in, and it was in the winter time. And at the time I was still commuting into Westminster on at least 3 days a week basis. So I'd got the train back from London up to Huntingdon and was driving back to come into the south of Chatteris. And there's, most of the roads in the Fens are really straight for about sort of 3 or 5 miles, and then they suddenly have a right angle bend, when you need to know it's there, otherwise you're straight in the dike. But this particular road was really snaking, and it really curved, quite gently, as if it was following an old riverbed. I don't know if it was or not, but I can remember going up there, and it was of course pitch black because I was driving up there at about 7 o'clock at night, and I saw what I thought was a UFO, and there was this incredible light, a horizontal light that took up kind of a third of the windscreen ahead of me. Maybe it was at this point, maybe it was more like the wing mirror size, but it was this incredible sort of flaming brightness that was in the road, and it moved. It was hovering it seemed to be hovering above the ground, and it was moving from the left to the right across the fenland. And it was really strange and really disconcerting as I was sort of going around these bends, getting closer and closer to Chatteris. And as I got closer, of course, perspective works this way, the thing was getting bigger and bigger and bigger until it really was taking up a third of the windscreen. And it was just this brightness that kept on hovering and moving left and right across. And I really had no idea what on earth this was until suddenly I realized that it was a massive farm fire, that actually it turned out that a farmer had built a new farm just next to the old farmhouse, and instead of demolishing it in the way that other people might have, he just set fire to it. And that was my introduction to the Fens. There are different people up there, Martin.
Yeah, it's a very different landscape, and you can certainly see from a long way. And so we sit up on the hill, we look across the top of the wind turbines that are out in Chatteris, Wisbeach, Chatteris and Warboys. So we're sort of that much we're 65 foot up, where the fenlands, 10 to 15 foot down.
So let's go into some of those details that you were talking about. You mentioned clay soil, and one of the things I hear from lots of farmers is that, I'm on clay soil, regen can't work for me. Is that true?
I think regen can work everywhere and anywhere, but the principles and the practices and that's thinking about where you are. We are clay-based soils, but each field is slightly different. We have some really healthy soils, and many of those were old pastures or something in the past, or had more manure on, organic matter. So every field we treat differently, and that does mean our soils are colder to get going in this, to warm up in the spring. When they get wet, they are wet. That might mean I need a tine cultivator, a tine drill instead of a disc drill. And it means that flexibility. But what we have found, and it actually wasn't me that noticed it, that as we're focusing on improving soil health, our soil has changed and become more forgiving. It was when our agronomist, the gentleman that comes and tells them which chemicals to be using, the pesticides to be using, and crops to be in his advice, he turned up one day, got out of his truck, took his wellies off that were covered in mud and put his boots on. And I said, "Oi, it's not coffee, we're going for a walk." And he says, "But your mud doesn't stick to me anymore." And it was that moment I realised that actually something was changing, and our soils, that while they're the heavy good clay content, they are adapting. They're becoming more friable. That organic matter that we're incorporating in through cover crops and other practices and straw chopping straw are making a slow benefit and a difference. And we've seen that this year in a really dry season. We've yields are down, but they're not disastrous. And yes, the price is disastrous because the price has dropped through the floor. But when I talk to some near neighbours who have not been doing the same practices or are still farming a very conventional way, moving lots of soil, they've had some really disastrous yields. And it's actually that kind of slow building up to build resilience into our system.
And so you're getting more water holding presumably in there, so that the crop is better able to grow even in those dry periods.
Yeah. I think it's better. It's holding better water. The structure's better. We've focused on making sure our drainage works well, so when there's excess, so that those roots can get down. And I think because we're not doing so much heavy soil movement, we just move it occasionally when we're incorporating manures. Those root structures and worm channels, all that storage you hear, I think that really works. We were doing some ditching work in the last couple of weeks, and where you dig down to cleaning the ditch out, just the depth of where the roots have gone and the structures there. And it really sort of opens your eyes, and where we put some drains in some fields, just how much our roots have gone through our soils to go chasing water. And that's got to be a benefit. And it also a benefit on a really wet year, like it has the last 2 years, to let the water flow through as much as possible. It stands in places. We're not immune to problems, but it is slowly improving.
And how do you manage water on your farm, Martin? Because Joe and I were talking about drainage. Joe wanted to raise the issue of drainage in the way in which, in the past, a few decades ago, there was a scheme where an awful lot of drainage infrastructure was put into farms, but this hasn't been kept up, and there isn't the same sort of financial incentive to do this at the moment. And so a lot of it's kind of breaking down. Do you have that sort of pipe infrastructure in your fields as well as trying to get the soil to work? How does it work for you?
Yeah, we're saying we'd had infrastructure put in post-war, and even some more newer. Lots of it is collapsing, filling up with silt. And the biggest challenge is when we're having high rainfall events, the water gets into those drainage pipes, and then where there's a blockage, it's bursting up through profile, which collapse the drain completely, or where we haven't maintained the ditches enough and the water can't get out the pipe fast enough. So we have a degrading infrastructure under our soil. Many of our fields are bigger fields now than they used to be because there was ditches and hedges that have been taken out post-war. So some of that infrastructure is collapsing, and that's why we're having a focus on routinely going around and cleaning ditches out, but also trying to slow the flow of water in ditches. And it's getting this compromise of getting our drainage working to get it off the field, but hold it in the water courses to let it flow through the soil as much as possible. And we're having to do more mold draining. We're on clay soil, so that mold drain, running a leg with a plug through it that will work. And before we try to think, well, if I concentrate on roots and worms, I won't need to think about drainage because that will do it all for me. It can do some, but I have to keep the infrastructure going. And we will have to look to invest on that infrastructure in the near term. And that's where the government could step up and look at facilities to help support that real high investment to put drainage back in. And how do we pay that off over a period of time? Because that will also reduce the oxidization of our soils, causing methane and gases coming off and the organic matter, and actually help deliver food security by having soils that are healthy to produce the goods we want.
You mentioned there when you get blockages in the drain that the water builds up and it bursts out and it collapses the infrastructure. Is it possible to identify where those blockages are and to manage them before that happens, or are you just kind of stuck with waiting for those bursts to happen and then sort of recognizing where that drain is and dealing with it at that point?
There is some, I mean, on a dry year, it gives you a really good indication where the water still stood. So that might be a problem where there's a blockage. We try and maintain all the outflows and remember where they are and sort of monitor them. We can clean some of them, but there's lots and lots of drains in every field and they all run. And I've only got so many maps, my grandfather and the people here before us. I mean, we've got Victorian and, even bush drains in places. You can still the evidence where they spade open the soil, drag bushes from the hedgerow, laid them in the bottom, and that organic matter just let the water seep through the soil. So we haven't got all the plans, but we've over the last 5 years, we were increasingly focused on maintenance and trying to identify the problems before they get too bad, because then it's a big expense and a new drainage system rather than a maintenance and fixing it where you think a blockage is. But trying to find a drain in a field when you've got a guide on a map that says it's there somewhere, trying to find that drain without destroying it with a digger can be a real challenge sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned bush drains there, which is something that I'd not come across before. And of course, an awful lot of drains when they go in, Victorian drains are kind of pottery pipes, aren't they? Clay pipes. And these days it might be plastic. Do you think that there's a future where that sort of bush drain infrastructure could be, reused and reintegrated as a matter of course? And obviously that might be the most nature friendly approach to drainage.
Yeah, or that French drain of putting some hardcore stone down and just for much of it, it's just moving, keeping the water moving to stop it ponding. If you're moving it from the middle of a big field across, that's going to might probably need a drain pipe. But if you're just moving it 10, 20 yards, 30 yards, putting some organic matter in there and making a sandwich of filtration that may just let that water move and maybe just stick the pipe on the end on the last few meters. And that can work. So, I mean, we've put lots of straw bales in the bottom, drop them in there and fill them in, and done all sorts in the past just as a temporary fix. And it's amazing how long that stays there for. Just that organic, thick content just gives enough to sort of keep the soil moving or the water moving within the soil.
It's fascinating. I just want to go back to, this year's harvest and the way in which you were saying, although your harvest is down, it's not down as much as some of your neighbours that are farming in different ways. But you also mentioned that we have this low harvest, but there's also been this price crash where there were low prices. Surely in other industries, if there was a scarcity of a product, then potentially the prices would increase. That doesn't seem to be the case here.
No, we will have a scarcity of product in this country, but globally, there's a massive amount. Because of the trade tariffs in America and the moving away from states, the aid program, there's huge quantities of grain, maize, soya available in America that has no home that was going for aid. So that's flooding the market. We've got good yields in other places because their weather's. We're a small island trading globally on commodities of grains, and actually it's quite cheap to bring it over on a boat and get it on board. And I think the previous governments in the past doing trade deals and not enforcing standards undermines the UK farmers so much, because as soon as the price point is better to import, regardless of quality, it's imported. And actually, if we had a clear standard of what health, good, nature-friendly production could be, of focusing on quality food, quality environmental outcomes, and quality climate outcomes, and built that, we would trade globally, but driving standards up, rather than sucking in the cheapest product that's grown or produced globally with no care for the impact it has there, or the impact on our own health.
We've talked, often you and I in the past about food security and some of those other issues that you raised there. But that's incredible, isn't it? That I can't imagine for one moment that these were reactions that Trump would have expected when he closed down USAID and introduced those tariffs. That suddenly there's a surfeit of grain that's then flooding the market globally, which then has this sort of depression effect on prices here and elsewhere around the world. I mean, that is an incredible sort of illustration of the way in which we are connected geopolitically, and the way in which our food security, to an extent, depends upon decisions that are taken, in places entirely different from Westminster.
Yeah, and the challenge is, as a farmer, we've had a number of years that the weather's been impacting. The price has gone down. We're producing less, and our price goes down. No other business or market operates like that. But farmers are not going to have the money to invest. They're not going to have the confidence to invest. So we're going to see a lot of exit of businesses and farmers. And I worry about actually the production level we'll have of security in the future. Because if we go too low, the infrastructure starts going, because that can't wait. The manufacturers, the machinery dealers, the processors, the abattoirs, everything else shrinks. And then we become into a real problem that if it comes back, I haven't got the infrastructure to sell into then, and it holds the market again. And that's where some of that food security, what the national governments should be looking at, is what is the core infrastructure do we need in this country to facilitate producing and delivering food on plates from our fields.
I've just come back from the Isle of Man, where I've been away for a couple of weeks, and as some listeners may know, I used to run the NFU on the Isle of Man as the general secretary there. And one of the challenges that we had at the time was the meat plant. The meat plant, the abattoir had been created, had been delivered. It was much too big a piece of infrastructure to support the market that existed on the island at the time, and so there was a constant issue with throughput. But at the time, there were also, and this is sort of 15, 20 years ago, there were also supermarkets on the Isle of Man that were committed to Manx produce of one kind or another. If meat was produced on the Isle of Man, it would get sold on the Isle of Man. There was a derogation that meant that there was a limit on the amount of red meat that could be brought in. But since then, just in the last few years, Tesco, that only had one store, has taken over ShopRite, which was the store that existed. It was actually owned by an Irish company or an Irish family, I think, but it sort of was on the Isle of Man and more committed to farmers. Since then, I don't think, now that Tesco's taken over those stores, Manx meat is available anywhere on the island. Certainly not in supermarkets. It may be, some independent retailers, and so the bottom has dropped out of that market. Means an awful lot of livestock are now being exported into England for slaughter, let alone sort of onward sales, and therefore the throughput for that meat plant has dropped through the floor again, meaning that those prices that are going back to farmers have risen, and the whole thing has just become incredibly difficult, with no immediate on-island market for the produce that's coming from the island. I mean, it's criminal, really. It's just awful, and that's in microcosm, I guess, an example of what happens and how important that infrastructure is. And if we look at the UK, then we look at the fibre industry, and it's really difficult, isn't it, to sell a fleece for a decent price from your sheep, because there just isn't the wool produced at scale in the UK. Fibre production is right down because we've lost that infrastructure as a result, and so we really need to guard against that happening to any greater degree. Make sure that we rebuild the infrastructure, if anything, that we get more small abattoirs, that we get more of this processing infrastructure in place.
Yeah, and I think it is that. Um, what's the unintended consequences of a supermarket buying out of things? What it breaks down, particularly for livestock. If they move out of the area they're produced to an abattoir or something further away, they don't come back to feed the people in that community in that location. That means the economic benefit and the system benefit goes. And I think that kind of goes back to the beginning of our conversation of the access to government, because I enjoy having those conversations of sort of, you're thinking about doing this from a farming practical point of view, I will see this domino effect in the future. So if we want to have more wool or get better value for wool, why are we not making it into insulation? Why are we not having policies that actually focus on that joined up circular system? So as a byproduct has a future home that drives value right through the supply chain and the economic benefit right through. And that goes back to the opportunity to make sure that governments and policymakers and supply chains, we are in that room trying to communicate the unintended consequences of their decisions before they actually make them, where then it really comes back and affects farmers now and in the future.
And of course, in terms of nature-friendly farming, often it is farmers that are supplying, and not always by any means, but often it is farmers that are supplying into those shorter supply chains that really rely on small abattoirs, for example, that are actually delivering an awful lot of that regeneration in the hills with their livestock. Do you have livestock on your farm, Martin, at all?
We have some sheep visiting. We used to have cattle. I'd love to get that back in, but the cost of the infrastructure and the cattle at the moment are too high to do that investment in an uncertain market. So we work with local shepherds who haven't, I've just given a grazing license or opportunity to a 16-year-old. I think he's got 20 sheep and he wants to build. So we've said, here's a field. We'll put it into a herbal lay. We can sort some water out for you. We're not going to charge you for it. You just go and integrate. The benefit of having those livestock on our soils and grazing at grass is valuable to us. So that's our value. And we've got to sort of work with others to make opportunities and stackable benefits within our farm. And I think the right livestock in the right place is a real benefit, but it's got to be done at a right balance.
Martin, there's so many things that you've raised and throughout the conversation, really, that I'd love to get into more. And there are so many more questions that I have. So it's a good job that we got 6 months at least to talk about these things. But let's move on and talk about the policy landscape, which you mentioned again just now. And let's talk about English policy, because that's where an awful lot of your advocacy goes. And just to say that the next program we do next month, we're going to be talking about Scottish policy with Adam Forrest from NFFN Scotland, who's going to come and talk about the NFFM Scotland conference that's taking place a bit later in the autumn. But focusing on England for a moment, clearly there are a lot of challenges taking place within government. Farmers have been railing against a whole range of different decisions that have been taken, inheritance tax obviously being the sort of topmost of that. Is the government getting anything right in England?
Uh, I think the review of what they're doing is right. They've not come in and kept traction happening and clear communication, and they're focused on the right value for schemes, delivering the right joined up approach is good. Not everything was perfect with the previous government, and there were some things that have put in place that have made this government picking up some difficult challenges. But I do think they can do better. They can communicate better, and actually, that's what they really want of a clear plan and focusing on Minette Batter's profitability review, a 25-year roadmap for farming, rather than we've got an environmental roadmap or plan. So, what is the vision? But we do need them to step up and get that communicating to us so we know where we're trying to invest and where that support will be for those areas.
It's interesting because you mentioned vision there, and much as one can criticize elements of what the previous government was doing, I think it's fair to say that they did have a vision and they communicated that vision to a pretty clear extent. It seems incredible that a month into a year into a new government, there really still doesn't seem to be a vision beyond farmers need to make it on their own, and gradually this funding support, this carpet is going to be, this rug is going to be pulled out from underneath farmers.
Yeah, if you listen to the various speeches by the ministers and secretary of state, I think there is clear language in there, but it's not been communicated as well. It's sort of their direction is to support a more nature friendly, a more balanced farming system where food, nature, climate come together on landscapes. But that clear narrative and messaging coming out of Defra and of government, I think many farmers are a bit annoyed with some of the language of food security is national security. And what does it really mean when we see policies that the schemes suddenly stop? Grants are available now, but not tomorrow. Area payments have become off quicker than what we had budgeted. As a farmer, I'd budgeted for a timeline of funding changing and hopefully new stuff coming in. They've accelerated the transition away from the payment we're receiving, but the new money is not there in front of us. We cannot apply, or many farmers cannot apply for stuff because it's not been brought forward. And I think that's the real challenge of a change of government with a change of focus of what they want to do from the previous government is that instability it's put into the whole system at a price where they went and done tax changes and commodity markets are on the floor.
And just in terms of, going back to you as an individual farmer, what's been the impact on you and your business of those changes financially?
Personally, it's been absolutely pretty significant. We're in some schemes. RPA were delayed in giving us our annual declaration, and we'd taken some options out of one scheme to make a better scheme of the next one, and we missed it because the RPA hadn't processed their thing. The capital grants just lately, we went to apply, but because the RPA hadn't cleaned our system, cleared some options off that we'd done previously in the last round of stuff, we couldn't apply. And I actually got an email last week to say it is now fixed. You can now, we've fixed your problems. The scheme finished 3-4 weeks ago. So it means, it's £180,000 of income I could have received on delivering public goods that has now stopped us on this farm doing more, bringing in the right infrastructure, actually doing a joined up approach with that significant amount of funding coming away from us from that area-based payment stuff. So, and on top of that, we've had 2 really wet years and a dry year, and the commodity prices have been really fluctual. So it's caused us really significant pain. And now, I've also got the potential of a railway line coming through the farm from Oxford to Cambridge. They may want 45% of the farm. Not sure quite when it is, but they're doing lots of work to investigate it. So what's our future plan for our farm and our soils and our system if that infrastructure is going to come through and significantly change our business? So for us, it's quite challenging at the moment.
I was going to say, I mean, aside from the financial challenges, and the substantial amount of money that you were expecting to get that you haven't got, and the impact that that's had, and I'm sure for many farmers that might mean that they simply don't do the nature-friendly sort of work, the ecological work that you're so committed to on your farm. That sort of puts back that whole sort of ecological change and that regenerative change. But then when you're talking about the potential of a railway line coming through, the psychological impact of that must be really quite immense.
Yeah, it literally is, because they want to do some archaeological, for an example, some archaeological trenching where this, not just the railway line, all the additional land they want to take, they're going to put 1 per acre of a 20-metre trench down to a metre. So there goes our drainage. Every field's going to have this but we don't know when. So do we plant? Do we wait? And that actually, the time and energy it's taken to engage with them and push them back and say why this and challenge it, where they're so lack of engagement is poor. It really adds a lot of pressure to us and my family and the business. And then it's that transition of I have been investing in that more nature-friendly thing. I can see the benefits of doing stuff. But the additionality that I could really deliver with some additional funding support to up the delivery for pollinators, predatory insects, public access, educational visits, all sorts of stuff that would really deliver better outcomes. I can't do that on my own, and I need some funding and public support to be able to deliver those elements on top of what I'm already doing. And that's where I get really disheartened sometimes. And I try and stay positive because I see the future can be a lot better. But I see policy and supply chains and government infrastructure come round that is really giving uncertainty for our own personal business here on a farm.
And so what's the process, Martin? If, for example, you do end up losing a third of the farm to that piece of infrastructure, is that going to be a compulsory purchase? Do you get some benefit out of that? What are your options then? Do you have to completely redesign the shape of your business? Or you're not just able, presumably, to find that land next door, but, just to replace the land that you've lost?
It's compulsory purchase. looking at other infrastructure. We're not sure when that payment will come. They'll
And
only
that'll be
pay
at
so much.
agricultural value,
Yeah,
presumably.
at basic agricultural value, regardless of any uplift of nature, carbon in our soils, or other developments that I could get benefit of BNG and other things. So we'll get that. We won't get full compensation for a year and 1 day after the railway line opens, if it happens.
If it
So that could be
opens,
10 to
okay.
15 years down the line
Mm.
before we receive full payment of the loss of income to our business and our our house and our farm. But then also that money, everyone else locally has also been impacted. So they're all looking for the same to spend the money again. So we might get compulsory purchase, we'll get paid some money. We may get some of the legal fees paid for. But if I go and buy some land, I'm going to pay stamp duty and legal fees over there. So it's going to cost me, and it is costing us now, for that interruption that I have no choice over. And they literally want to do what they want to our farm, take our drive, plant some trees, put some ponds. They're doing what they like with us having to stand here and just question what they want to do and why and push back. There may be some benefits of the biodiversity net gain, some of the environmental features, but it actually puts a railway line 30 yards at the top of my garden. And I've grown up on this farm. I know every tree, wildlife, drain, soil, field. It's not somewhere I feel it will be my home in the long term future.
Feels like it must be a really difficult place for you as the leader of the Nature Friendly Farming Network of an NGO that's working to government and trying to sort of put that positive face on farming, positive sort of face on policy responses, and yet you've got this challenge in your own backyard. That sounds like a really tough balancing act.
Yeah, and when I'm representing the organisation, I represent all our farm members, and that means making sometimes advocating things I actually won't personally do my business as much as it could, but it's the right thing to do to help the farm industry of all of our members champion those things while I face many challenges at home. And it is quite hard sometimes, particularly where I see policymakers and decision makers do daft decisions and just communicate in poor way. You just think you've got to get up in the morning and try and be happy and energetic and engage in ways that try and get better outcomes for the future. Well, personally, we face many challenges in our own home business and with infrastructure coming around us.
I wanted to ask you about the government rhetoric in relation to farming and to nature, because we seem to have two different stories that are being told, and and that story that you've just told about your own farm really exemplifies some of the challenges here, where you were talking about the way in which you think if there is any vision from government at all, then it is around the idea of having more nature-friendly farming, getting nature better integrated within agriculture. But then at the same time, we have this communication in relation to planning and the suggestion that nature is a problem, that nature is somehow an impediment to having new houses and new infrastructure. How do you feel the government is communicating its various different policies and visions in these different departments? And how is that conflict sort of being recognised between farmers?
I think some of the communication is at odds with their own government and their own departments. You're hearing infrastructure and Rachel Reeves, growth, housing, newts and bats are in our way and we're going to push on with it. Actually, nature underpins our whole economy, our whole system, and we need to make it work in tandem. Yes, developments will always cause problems. Farming causes problems, but we've got to get the right balance going forward and join that up. And I don't think many within this government, and we heard it in the rhetoric in the previous government, is that joined up approach of the role of nature and access of healthy food, access to nature, joined up developments and infrastructure that gets the best of both worlds, rather than make the typical argument it's in the way and it's stopping development. And some of that's the policies that have been designed and the investment in more and more surveys rather than talk to people on the ground. It goes back to the railway line coming around here. They're doing all the biodiversity surveys. They've not once asked me for my evidence and research I've got on the farm where I know the little owl nest, the kestrel's nesting. So they're paying more and more money for surveys where they're not using local knowledge. And I'd love to get Rachel Reeves out and various other people on farms and say, and in landscapes, this is what we could do if we do it in a joined up approach. What you're doing is costing a huge amount of money and will cause lots of negative impacts, not just to the environment, but to so many other things.
And of course, in terms of nature and nature gain and understanding nature, it's not just about those sort of larger birds that you're talking about there, the little owl and the kestrel. It's about the microfauna and the worms and everything else that's in the soil. You know, this is the bedrock of biodiversity, isn't it? And it's all very well to say, you know, we're going to stick some infrastructure in here and we're going to, you know, create some benefit over there. But you've got to work from the basis that you really understand the complexity and the nuance of biodiversity before you start.
Yeah, and that's part of my journey as a farmer. I was taught how to produce crops and animal husbandry. That understanding the microbiology, you know, all of the small stuff that's in our soil and nature and how it all works together blows your mind when you start looking at it. And we can't just come in and just say, "Oh, we're just going to plant some more trees over there, and move, or put a pond there, and we're going to move those newts." That whole infrastructure of what their habitat is has to be all interconnected. You can't have islands of good. And it comes back to the farming. We can't just have islands of nature friendly and farms that are doing that really joined up approach, and then not for farms, and then some more. Nature needs to be interconnected, and that's where I think we're going to have to work in the future of clusters, catchments together. And actually, not everyone has to do loads, but everyone needs to do some and join it up. And then it joins it up to our developments and our housing estates and getting people out and getting food into communities in a better, more intuitive way of feeding and engaging people.
Yeah, I'm aware that we are starting to run a bit short on time, and so I'm going to move on. And you'll notice this about me, Martin, that we have a good plan, and then we end up having an interesting conversation and have to skip things. But obviously, we're going to come back to policy, and we're going to come back to funding over the course of the next few programs as we go forward. But I think before we kind of move on from this conversation, we should talk a little bit about the comms. You touched on it there, the difference between the communications, you know, around planning of infrastructure from Rachel Reeves, from Angela Rayner, and then from Defra. But even within Defra, the comms can be pretty tone deaf, can't it? And there are challenges, as you said. We had a change of government, a change of policy, where there is an ending of schemes that have been put in place by previous governments. But they're really not doing a very good job of sugaring the pill, are they? When they tell farmers that they're losing something or that something's changing, they're not managing to set up that policy conversation to gently bring these things in. They are just kind of ramming them home and then telling people, well, you've just got to live with it. And that's the way it is.
Yeah, I think many farmers feel that what comes out is insensitive and not in the real world, and it goes back to it gives the role of the Nature Friendly Farming Network and other to engage and communicate to decision makers and governments and policymakers of what that may look like and how they can language. And I hope, and I've had some commitments from people in Defra that the communication will improve, and they want to engage more. But they also want to work out how that works. The budget last year, I think government across the board put the barriers up, so they then forgot to engage because they were unsure what their farmers are going to have a complain about, or they knew. And actually, we've got to do that better going forward. And there's a role for the network and other stakeholders and organisations to communicate the message of government. It doesn't mean we have to agree with it, but if that's what they want to get out, we want to make sure as many farmers as possible hear all of it, not just a soundbite or what they hear online.
And I guess that means that the government needs to be clear about what those messages are, exactly what it is they're trying to achieve, so that you're able to communicate that. Because, and as you say, this is something I've criticised the NFU for in the past, that they haven't done a good job of explaining what the government's trying to do. They've simply complained about what the government is doing. And I think you're right that there is a real role there in explaining what the government trajectory is, what farmers can expect from the government. But the government does need to be clear about it if they have any right to expect organisations like NFFN to do that job for them.
Yeah, and I've really challenged them, and we've hopefully got some good commitments that get delivered. We're not there just to be the government's mouthpiece. We actively hold government to account as much as possible, quite often in rooms, sometimes in media and in other spaces. But they've got to work with us. They've got to explain their plans in their government language that I may be able to, and other organisations, communicate it in farmer language. Because quite often what the policymaker says, the farmer doesn't understand. And there's got to be some interpretation by organisations to their members and to the wider community of really what needs to happen.
Do you think it's possible, because there has been such a disintegration of sort of trust between the government and farmers, sometimes fueled, I think it would be fair to say, by some of the farmers' organisations that have been kind of ramping up the rhetoric, but certainly the government's done, it's played its own role in really damaging this relationship. Do you think it's possible to restore that relationship? Certainly, with the farmers that you talk to within the network, do you think that there is any sympathy with government at all?
I think for many, that trust is really breaking down or broken down, and they're really just disheartened with this stop start, not knowing. No, as a business, you can't plan for what's coming down the line in funding. But I do feel many are seeing the solutions and are seeing the benefits, and they will come back and want to work with government in delivering things. And also, it's sometimes the only income stream to get some money into your business to deliver some outcomes of a product. It may be a nature product, it may be a food product, it may be flooding product, but it's that. So if the money's there and it's at the right level and the asks are right, farmers will engage. But if they do it wrong, many farmers are going to say, "I'll leave you alone. I'm going to get on with what I want to do. I'll meet regulation baseline, but I'll farm my farm how I please."
Just before we kind of round the programme out, I just want to talk about Secretary of State Steve Reed, because he came a couple of weeks or so ago, didn't he, to your farm? How did you get on with him there? How did that go? Do you think he gets what you're trying to do?
Yeah, so I've met him a number of times, but actually to have him out on farm and we had a good walk around and a good discussion, actually seeing it in a field and talking about the value of the habitat, not just the grass margin, but what's in the grass margin and how we're having to spend money in enhancing that for public good, for the benefit, not just of our farm, and the cost of hedgerows and talking about stone walls. Some of the infrastructure in our landscape is a core cost to my business, but doesn't deliver any benefit to my business, but it does for the wider society. That's your public goods. And then also, what's that funding needed to help farmers transition? And what are those options and outcomes? So I think he really gets it. He got it. His language was really welcoming and I thought really constructive of understanding the role of nature in our systems and trying to tackle some of the fundamental problems in farming and its pollution and its profitability in getting better outcomes. So I think he got it. He understood it. And we had some really good discussions around the solutions to that and where are those levers, not just what he has, but other government departments and private markets and supply chains. Who owns the responsibility for some of the stuff that needs to happen?
Do you think that Steve Reed is strong enough to get a good listening from Treasury to win some of the money back that's necessary going forward, and indeed to pull together to create that sort of joined up approach across different government departments to build those private markets and accelerate delivery of those private markets around natural capital? Do you think that he's strong enough as a Secretary of State to achieve those things?
I think he has proved himself to be fairly strong because actually we didn't decrease the budget. There was real risk of that happening. And actually some budget was increased for some of the environmental outcomes because Treasury understood that they need delivering to meet targets or deliver benefits. The challenge would be, I think he can be a really good advocate for us, but if he's too good, he'll get moved on to another department. And that's the real challenge. If we have a reshuffle at any time soon, do we end up the deck shares changing again and having to start again? And that's my real concern. We need somebody in that role, and I think Steve could be that role of really pushing at the agenda through the government departments. But he needs to, we need someone to stay in the role for a long period of time to really get traction on the delivery, not just the asks. And delivery takes a number of years to get the whole system joined up to what they want to achieve.
It's always the challenge, isn't it, where Defra still remains today at the bottom of the ministerial food chain, when really, when we're talking about the issues that we're talking about, whether it's food security, ecological security, climate, biodiversity, etc., it really ought to be considered much higher up the agenda. But because its budget's small, it kind of sits and nestles down there at the bottom. In terms of, whether if you're sort of thinking in terms of the NFFN or thinking in terms of those broader NGOs and farmers representative organisations, what are the buttons do you think that people should be trying to press in terms of their conversations with Steve?
I think that food's important. We all got to eat and food production, but it's all of the other goods and services, the fibre, the timber, the flood mitigation, the carbon sequestration, nature, access. We've got to champion all of it and help Defra demonstrate to the wider society and to wider government departments of the role of healthy soil to have healthy food, reduce the NHS, not just see Defra as this small department over here. What we produce from our land, from our farmed landscape, involves all departments across government, and that's what we should be championing: that multifunctionality of our landscapes and the assets we can deliver that all departments and all governments should be invested in. Why are we investing in like £22 billion in carbon sequestration for tech we haven't invented yet? Increase soil organic matter 1%, and there's most of your carbon sequestered, and it delivers so many other multiple benefits. But we have not been communicating that as an industry and championing not just the food we produce, but all of the other stuff that are core to what we can and we do deliver.
And that constructive approach that you mentioned, I think, is so critical. And as you say, it's about helping the industry, getting the industry to have a clear voice about the incredible value that it delivers within the countryside in terms of food, fibre, natural capital, amenity, access, well-being, all of these different things, and public health, and to help Defra to make that case across government, to help Defra is I guess one of the things that the NFFN does that is different to some of the other organisations, and to sort of work on that constructive relationship between farming as an industry and government, as both a policy maker and a delivery mechanism for some of the funding. Look, just briefly, because we need to finish, could you talk us through what's happening in Scotland? I mentioned before that Adam Forrest from NFFN Scotland is going to join us next time to talk through some of the Scottish land use policy, but there's a conference coming up, isn't there, in Scotland?
Yeah, beginning of September, we've got our Scotland's first nature-friendly farming summit, an event for farmers, policymakers, environmental leaders to explore how farming can restore nature, ensure long-term food security and support profitable farming. So we're trying to bring all of those stakeholders and organisations and policymakers into a room, and then lead it with farmers already doing some of those actions, and bring in policymakers to talk about what they need, and we can demonstrate how our farmers are already trying to deliver that, to then really set the agenda. We've got an election in Scotland in next May, so we're starting to build on that. What could our farm landscapes do, and what does the government support look like? So it should be a really good event with a range of different speakers and activities. And it's really good to sort of talk about that at the next podcast.
And is that, you said the beginning of September? Is it beginning of September or beginning of October?
Beginning of October.
Beginning of October. And if people want to find out more, how can they find out more and get tickets for that?
Have a look on our website. There are various social media and other posts coming out, and tickets will be available through the Eventbrite soon.
Brilliant. Martin, I think that's probably all we have time for. And it's been really interesting having you on and having a sort of more general conversation. And I hope people have enjoyed it. And certainly, we're going to, develop these conversations, develop that sort of on podcast relationship over the next few months as well. We're going to finish there. If you haven't listened yet, then we broadcast a leaders conversation with Andy Cato, which I really enjoyed. I thought was really interesting, particularly, the sort of earlier stages of Andy's life, and how he got into music, his life as a trombone player, and then his challenges getting into farming, and the final solution for him, which was farming and processing, and therefore developing wild farm bread. And a discussion with the National Infrastructure Commission for Wales about why they've put the voice of nature on their board and what that means. How do you represent the voice of nature on a board in terms of flooding decisions? A discussion about how we accelerate delivery of biodiversity net gain so that becomes an opportunity for more farmers, not just the small number that are currently able to benefit from that. And of course, the latest Wheat from the Chaff, in which Joe Stanley and Nikki Yoxall go head to head and discuss their different takes on regenerative farming. Look, I hope you've enjoyed listening. Please come back and listen to more. Tell your friends, like us, comment and review us, and share our links. It all really helps to build the Farmgate listening family. Farmgate is part of 8.9.com, the land use news channel, which is sponsored by First Milk, Pelican Ag, Rural Solutions, the Usk Catchment Partnership, Agrolo, and individual donors. I've been FFINLO COSTAIN. Bye for now.
And I've been Martin Lyons. Goodbye.